John Turner hadn't expected his peaceful Saturday afternoon to unravel so quickly. The sun was just dipping behind the rolling hills, casting a golden glow over his sprawling ranch, when he spotted something strange. Brightly colored flyers, taped haphazardly to his wrought iron gate, fluttered in the light breeze. Curious, he pulled the nearest one loose and read the bold letters. "Join us for the wedding of Sarah and Michael, this Saturday, 3 p.m. at the Turner Ranch." John blinked, confused. His ranch? His private land? He hadn't received a single call, email, or letter about any wedding, and the fact that the flyer called it Turner Ranch only made it worse. This was his sanctuary, the place where he escaped from the noisy world, tended to the land his family had cared for over generations. His heart pounded as he dialed the HOA office number printed at the bottom of the flyer. The line clicked, and a calm, overly polite woman answered. "Good afternoon. This is Claire at Crestwood HOA. How may I assist you?" "Claire, this is John Turner, the owner of the ranch on Willow Creek Road," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just found a flyer saying there's going to be a wedding on my property this Saturday. Did you approve this?" There was a pause. Then, "Oh, Mr. Turner, we didn't approve any weddings on your land. That must be a mistake. Perhaps it was a private event booked through another party?" John's blood ran cold. Mistake? Private event? On his ranch? That didn't make sense. "I'm the property owner." "Nobody contacted me," he insisted, his voice growing firmer. "You're the HOA. If anyone approved anything, it would be you. This isn't just some mistake. Mr. Turner, please understand that the HOA has community easements that sometimes allow for special events on shared or private spaces," Claire said, the polite tone not matching the firm words. "You should have received a notice if there was an event planned." John frowned. No notice, no permission. He stared out at the ranch beyond the gate, the tall grass swaying quietly as if mocking his frustration. As he hung up, his neighbor, Mrs. Collins, an older woman with keen eyes and a reputation for knowing neighborhood secrets, approached slowly from her porch. "John, I heard there's a big wedding planned on your land. Did you get any word?" she asked quietly, glancing around as if expecting the wind to carry away her words. "No, Mrs. Collins. I just found out like you," John replied. "And the HOA says it's covered by some easement. But I don't recall signing anything like that." She lowered her voice. "You might want to be careful poking around. The HOA board's been, secretive lately. Some folks say they're making deals behind closed doors." John's brows knitted together. What deals? And why wasn't he in the loop? His ranch wasn't just land to him. It was a legacy to have. The HOA possibly sell rights to it without his say felt like a betrayal. Later that evening, John stood at the edge of his property, watching the fading daylight bleed into shadows. The flyer still clung to the gate, a glaring announcement of an event he neither wanted nor approved. He thought of the guests who would soon arrive, of strangers trampling his fields, setting up tents on his soil, his fists clenched. No one was going to use his ranch without his permission, not without consequences. As he turned back to the house, a chill ran down his spine, not from the cooling air but from the sudden realization. This was just the beginning. Something bigger was happening, and John was caught in the middle. The ranch, his refuge, was about to become the battleground. The next morning, John woke with a restless energy he hadn't felt in years. His peaceful ranch was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a front line. The flyers stuck in his mind like nails, pricking his sense of justice. He knew one thing for sure. He needed to confront the HOA board directly. At the Crestwood Community Hall, the air was thick with quiet chatter as residents gathered for the monthly HOA meeting. John pushed open the door, scanning the room. Familiar. Faces turned toward him, some surprised, others wary. Word of the unauthorized wedding had already spread like wildfire. John made his way to the front, where the HOA board members sat behind a long table, papers and coffee cups scattered in front of them. The board president, Mr. Simmons, a tall man with a meticulously groomed beard and an unreadable expression, looked up sharply. "Mr. Turner," Simmons said, his voice smooth but guarded, "what brings you here today?" John didn't hesitate. "I'm here because my ranch is being used for a wedding this weekend, without my permission. I want to know how that's possible." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others whispered urgently. Simmons cleared his throat. "Mr. Turner, the community operates under a set of bylaws and easements designed to protect shared interests. There is a clause that allows the HOA to permit special events on properties within the community, under certain circumstances." John's eyes narrowed. "Under certain circumstances? Did you notify me? Did I agree to this?" "No, Mr. Turner, you were not notified because the board exercised its discretion. We believed this event would benefit the community and had no reason to believe it would upset you." John felt the room closing in. The board was dismissing his ownership rights like they were a trivial obstacle, but he wasn't about to let this slide. "Benefit the community? By hosting a wedding on my private land without telling me? You don't get to decide that for me." The room tensed. Simmons's eyes flickered for a brief moment. Something behind the polished veneer cracked, but he quickly masked it with a calm smile. "There are legal precedents supporting community easements. This is not unusual." He gestured toward the documents on the table. "We are prepared to defend this." John's heart raced. "I want to see those documents, the specific easement that gives you this power." Simmons hesitated but nodded. "You will receive a copy." After the meeting, John lingered, watching the board members converse in hushed tones. One of them, a younger woman named Linda, caught his gaze briefly, her eyes flickering with an unspoken warning. Outside, the cool wind bit at John's face. The peaceful facade of the community was cracking, revealing something much darker beneath. He realized this was no simple bureaucratic misstep. Someone was pushing an agenda, and he was the obstacle. Back at his ranch, John pulled out his grandfather's old leather-bound book of land deeds and easements. His fingers trembled as he flipped through the fragile pages, searching for any mention of the mysterious clause Simmons cited. Hours passed, shadows lengthened, but there was nothing. No record, no signed agreement, no consent. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Collins flashed on the screen. "Be careful. Not everything is as it seems with the board." John's gut twisted. What was she trying to warn him about? That night, sleep eluded him. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, sounding almost like a warning. The flyer on his gate still hung, fluttering defiantly, daring the HOA to push him further. John made a decision. If the board wouldn't listen to reason, he'd find another way to protect what was rightfully his. He would dig deeper, uncover every hidden clause and secret deal. The wedding might be set, but the fight was just beginning, and John was ready to bring it to light, no matter what storm it would bring. The dawn brought little comfort. Gray clouds gathered over the horizon, casting an ominous shadow across John's ranch. The land that had always felt like a sanctuary now pulsed with a strange tension, an unsettling silence before a storm. Both literal and figurative, John stepped outside just as the first workers arrived. Trucks rumbled down the dirt road, their engines growling like unwelcome predators. Men in hard hats and reflective vests unloaded tents, folding chairs, and massive decorations. They moved with practiced efficiency, oblivious to the angry glare that followed them from John's porch. "Hey," John called, his voice firm but calm. "Who gave you permission to be here?" A foreman glanced up, his expression tight. "Sir, the HOA gave us the green light. We're setting up for the wedding." John's fists clenched. "My land, my rules. You have no right." The foreman shrugged. "Look, I'm just doing my job." The words stung, but John knew fighting the workers now would only slow him down. He needed to focus on the bigger picture. Inside the house, he pulled out a dusty box filled with old documents, searching desperately for any clues about the HOA's claim. His fingers trembled as he scanned page after page, property deeds, water rights, ancient letters from long-dead ancestors. Then, tucked between brittle papers, he found it, a yellowed, barely legible document that spoke of a community easement established decades ago. But the wording was vague, ambiguous, nothing that clearly gave the HOA the right to host events, on private land without consent. The deeper John read, the more questions swirled in his mind. Why was the HOA so adamant? What were they hiding? Later that afternoon, John drove into town to visit the local county records office. He spent hours sifting through public records, maps, and legal filings. At last, he uncovered a recent, unusually hurried amendment to the community bylaws, one that seemed to broaden the HOA's power dramatically, signed off by a small, selective group of board members. But the signatures were faint, almost illegible. John's suspicion deepened. Had the board manipulated the rules while residents weren't paying attention? Was this rushed amendment the key to their audacity? Returning home, John spotted his neighbor, Mrs. Collins, tending her garden. Her eyes flicked toward the activity, on his ranch with a mixture of concern and fear. "Mrs. Collins," John began cautiously, "do you know anything about this amendment, or why the board might be pushing so hard for this wedding?" She glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "I've heard whispers, John. Rumors of deals being made, favors called in. Some say the board wants to raise money for a project, something big, and your ranch is just collateral." John's jaw tightened. Collateral. His family's land. Being used as a bargaining chip in a game he never agreed to play. That evening, the first raindrops began to fall, light at first, then heavier. The sky darkened quickly, mirroring John's growing unease. As water pooled in the dirt paths and the workers hurried to cover the delicate floral arrangements, John watched from his porch, a plan forming in his mind. The irrigation system he'd inherited from his grandfather, a relic of old ranching days, was still intact. It could simulate sudden rainstorms over large areas. Maybe, just maybe, it could send a message. His fingers brushed over the old control panel, rusty but functional. He tested it cautiously, watching as a fine mist rose from the ground, dampening the grass. The storm outside wasn't part of nature's design alone. It might soon be John's ally. As night fell, John sat on his porch, eyes fixed on the dark clouds swirling above. The peaceful life he once knew was slipping away, replaced by a brewing conflict he was determined to win. The ranch was no longer just a place to live. It was his battlefield, and the storm was just beginning. The morning after the unexpected rain, the wedding preparations at John's ranch lay in disarray. Tents sagged with soaked fabric, chairs stuck to muddy ground, and delicate floral arrangements wilted under the relentless drizzle. The HOA workers moved sluggishly, their faces tight with frustration and uncertainty. John stood at the edge of his property, watching the chaos unfold with a quiet satisfaction that surprised even him. He had triggered the old irrigation system overnight, releasing a controlled but relentless rainstorm over the main event area. It wasn't just a prank, it was a message. Yet the battle had only just begun. Inside his study, John pored over his grandfather's journal, searching for more clues about the ranch's defenses. The journal mentioned the irrigation system as a last resort against drought and pests, but John saw new potential. If wielded cleverly, it could disrupt any unauthorized event without harming the land. His mind raced. The HOA thought they could steamroll him with legalese and secret meetings, but he had something they didn't, a deep connection to this land and a plan to fight back quietly but effectively. The phone rang abruptly, jolting John from his thoughts. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Turner?" said a voice on the other end, low and urgent. It was Linda, the young HOA board member who had met his gaze at the last meeting. "You've made quite an impression. The board's meeting tonight, expect." "Some resistance." John frowned. "What do you mean?" "Some members want to push ahead with the wedding regardless, but others are worried. Your actions, they've shaken things up. Just be ready. This won't end quietly." After the call, John felt the weight of the coming confrontation settle over him. He wasn't just fighting a wedding anymore. He was fighting the entire board's agenda. That afternoon, the community buzzed with rumors. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, some siding with John, others fearing the growing tension. The local cafe became an unofficial war room where John gathered allies, farmers, longtime residents, anyone who valued fairness and the sanctity of private land. Together they planned a silent rebellion, not with protests or noise, but with vigilance and subtle defiance. They would monitor every HOA move, document every meeting, and most importantly, support John's right to defend his ranch. As dusk fell, John returned to the ranch and inspected the irrigation controls again. He calibrated the system carefully, setting timers and zones to simulate natural rain patterns, but only where needed. His rebellion would be precise and controlled. He wasn't out to destroy the land, only to protect it. The night deepened, and John's thoughts darkened with it. He knew the HOA's next steps would be desperate and ruthless, but he was ready. The ranch was no longer a passive piece of property. It was a fortress, and John its vigilant guardian. With a final glance at the storm-darkened sky, John whispered, "Bring it on." The morning of the wedding dawned with an uneasy calm. The air was thick with humidity, the heavy clouds hanging low, as if the sky itself held its breath. John watched from a distance, his eyes narrowing at the preparations marching relentlessly forward. Despite the previous day's deluge, tents were being reassembled, delicate lace decorations carefully draped again, and strings of fairy lights hung like fragile webs between towering oak trees. The guests began arriving, smiling, dressed to the nines, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling beneath the festive surface. John stood near the old irrigation system's control panel, his fingers brushing over the switches. He didn't want to ruin the day entirely, just enough to send a clear message. Unauthorized use of his ranch would not be tolerated. From his vantage point, he saw the bride and groom take their places beneath the floral arch, their faces radiant with hope and happiness. The officiant began speaking, his voice ringing clear through the quiet crowd. "Do you, Michael, take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The first drops fell as if timed perfectly, light at first, barely noticeable. Guests glanced up, murmuring with confusion. Then the rain picked up, soft pitter-patter becoming a steady drumbeat. The sky darkened further, thunder rolling ominously in the distance. Some guests scrambled for shelter under the tents, but John's system was relentless. Hidden sprinklers, previously unnoticed, began spraying with increasing force. Chairs slid on the slick grass. Bouquets soaked through within moments. The groom's smile faltered. The bride gasped as a gust of wind tore the delicate fabric from the arch, sending petals scattering like lost promises. The crowd's cheerful chatter turned to chaos. Children shrieked and ran for cover. Guests slipped and stumbled. The wedding. Photographer cursed under his breath, struggling to protect his expensive equipment. Inside the chaos, John felt a grim satisfaction. The HOA had pushed him too far, ignoring his rights and his voice. Now, his ranch was reclaiming itself, drenched in defiance. But the moment wasn't without risk. Voices shouted accusations from the soaked crowd, pointing fingers at the HOA. The board members appeared, soaked and furious, desperately trying to restore order. "Stop this madness!" Mr. Simmons yelled, his carefully constructed calm shattered by the storm. John stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. "This is my land. Nobody uses it without my permission. If you want to hold a wedding here, you come to me first." The crowd quieted, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. A few neighbors nodded in agreement, their eyes meeting John's with newfound respect. Simmons glared but found no words. The power shift was undeniable. The rain began to ease, the storm, retreating as suddenly as it had come, leaving behind a soaked but awakened community. John knew this was just one battle in a longer war. But for now, he had made his point. His ranch would not be commandeered without his say. As the guests slowly dispersed, wet and disgruntled, John stood alone on the sodden earth, the scent of rain heavy in the air. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, a reminder that storms, both in the sky and in life, could come suddenly and fiercely. And John was ready to face them. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered like a dark cloud over the Crestwood community. The failed wedding left the HOA board bruised and furious, but John's quiet rebellion had ignited something far larger than he had anticipated. That Monday morning, the phone calls began. Sharp, clipped messages from attorneys representing the HOA threatened legal action. John's mailbox filled with official letters citing breach of easement and interference with authorized activities. The board insisted they had every right to hold the wedding and that John's interference was not only unlawful, it was costly. John read each letter with growing frustration but also a stubborn resolve. He knew the law could be murky, especially when powerful interests were involved. Still, he refused to back down. Meanwhile, whispers rippled through the neighborhood. Some residents sided with John, admiring his courage. Others feared he was stirring unnecessary conflict, risking the peace of their community. John noticed the subtle shifts. Neighbors who once greeted him warmly now gave curt nods or avoided his gaze altogether. One afternoon, as John repaired a fence post battered by the recent storms, a shadow fell across his work. Looking up, he saw Claire, the HOA's polite but distant office manager, approaching with a tentative expression. "Mr. Turner," she began carefully, "the board wants to meet with you privately. They want to find a solution before this escalates further." John wiped his hands on his jeans, wary but curious. "I'm listening." They arranged to meet at the local cafe later that day, a neutral ground away from the tension of the ranch, or the sterile confines of the community hall. When John arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Sitting across from him were Mr. Simmons and Linda, the younger board member who had warned him before. Their faces were less stern now, edged with exhaustion and something closer to desperation. "We want to avoid a legal battle," Simmons said, voice low. "It's bad for everyone, residents, the HOA, and you. We're willing to renegotiate the terms regarding the easement." John's eyes narrowed. "Negotiate? After all this? You acted behind my back, ignored my rights, then tried to force a wedding on my property." Linda spoke quietly, her tone more sincere. "There are powerful interests involved. Developers who want access to certain parts of the community. The wedding was a test, a way to assert control." John's heart pounded. Developers. The subtle hints Mrs. Collins had mentioned were true, and worse than he'd feared. His ranch was more than a battleground for a wedding. It was a prize in a much larger game. "We can work with you," Simmons added, "but you have to cooperate. Help us find a way that respects your property and the community's needs." John stared at them, torn between anger and pragmatism. Could he trust them? Or was this another attempt to divide and conquer? As they talked, John's mind raced. If developers were lurking, if the HOA was compromised, the fight was far from over. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this to his advantage. Leaving the cafe, John felt a chill, not from the spring breeze, but from the realization that the war for his ranch had just entered a deeper, darker phase. The enemy was no longer just an HOA board, but but shadowy powers pulling strings behind closed doors. He would need allies, strategy, and cunning, and the storm that started with a wedding was about to unleash a tempest far greater than anyone imagined. John couldn't shake the weight of the cafe conversation as he returned to his ranch. The mention of developers lurking behind the HOA's actions gnawed at him, casting long shadows over the land he had vowed to protect. If those whispers were true, the stakes were far higher than a simple wedding or disputed easement. They were about to be swept into a battle that could change the very fabric of Crestwood. Determined to get to the bottom of it, John began digging deeper. Days blurred into nights as he sifted through public records, tax documents, and city planning proposals at the county office. The more he uncovered, the more the puzzle pieces fell into place. There was an unmarked proposal filed months ago, a plan to rezone large portions of Crestwood, including parts of his ranch, for commercial development. A sprawling complex of luxury homes, shopping centers, and even a private golf course. But what startled John most were the names attached to the proposal. Names linked directly to members of the HOA board. Linda's warning echoed in his mind. Powerful interests. Could his neighbors, the very people elected to protect the community, be conspiring to sell it out from under everyone's feet? John felt a knot tighten in his chest. Betrayal stung deeply, but it also fueled his resolve. That evening, he decided to confront Mrs. Collins, hoping her knowledge of the community's history might shed light on the board's secret motives. He found her tending her garden, the fading light casting long shadows among the blooms. "I know about the rezoning," John said bluntly. "The board's planning to sell parts of the ranch and the community for development. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Mrs. Collins sighed, her eyes weary but fierce. "Many of us have known, but fear keeps most silent. The board's power is strong. They've intimidated those who speak out." She paused, lowering her voice. "But you're different. You're willing to fight. You have the history of this land behind you." John nodded. "Then we need proof and allies." Together, they plotted their next move. John would gather hard evidence of the board's collusion with developers, emails, financial records, anything that could expose their agenda. Mrs. Collins promised to discreetly rally trusted neighbors. The community was divided, but there were many who loved their homes and the land as fiercely as John did. Days later, under the cover of darkness, John received an anonymous package slipped through his mailbox. Inside were scanned documents, emails between board members, and a developer outlining payments, timelines, and strategies to silence dissenters. The betrayal was staggering. With the proof in hand, John felt a surge of hope tempered by caution. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. It was about the future of Crestwood itself. But exposing the truth would be dangerous. He sensed eyes watching him more closely now, hushed conversations stopping abruptly as he approached. The storm John had summoned with his irrigation system was nothing compared to the tempest gathering in the shadows. And yet, despite the danger, John was ready. Because sometimes, protecting what you love means standing against the darkest secrets and risking everything. The community hall was packed that evening, tension buzzing in the air like static before a lightning strike. John stood at the back, clutching a folder heavy with proof, emails, contracts, and payment records that exposed the board's scheme to sell Crestwood to developers. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and suspicion. Neighbors whispered nervously, eyes flicking between the accused board members and John. Mr. Simmons and his allies sat stiffly at the front, their faces masks of forced composure. Linda, once a reluctant conspirator, now sat quietly, eyes cast downward. John stepped forward, his voice steady but charged. "I stand here not just as a homeowner but as a guardian of this land. This ranch, this community. It's more than property or profit, it's our home." He laid out the evidence piece by piece, revealing the tangled web of deceit spun by the HOA board and their developer partners. Murmurs swelled into gasps as the truth settled over the crowd like a heavy rain. Suddenly, the room went dark. The lights flickered and died, plunging everyone into a charged silence. Phones illuminated worried faces, the only glow in the sudden blackout. From the shadows near the back, a voice rang out, a sharp, commanding tone. "Enough!" The crowd turned toward the source, where a figure emerged. Claire, the HOA office. "Manager, pale but resolute. I couldn't stay silent any longer," she said, stepping forward. "I've seen the meetings, the threats, the intimidation, but I have something else. Something that changes everything." Claire pulled out a small flash drive and handed it to John. With shaky hands, John plugged it into his laptop, which the community hall had set up for presentations. The screen flickered to life, revealing hidden camera footage, secret meetings between Simmons, other board members, and the developer, discussing bribes, voter suppression, and plans to silence dissent. The crowd erupted. Some shouted for justice. Others cried in disbelief. But then the real twist came. In the chaos, Linda stood up, her voice clear and unwavering. "I was part of it," she admitted. "I helped draft those amendments, but I didn't know the full extent. Once I realized what they planned, I tried to warn John." She paused, eyes scanning the room. "I've switched sides. Help me stop this before it's too late." John looked at her, weighing the truth in her words. He nodded slowly. "We need every ally we can get." The HOA board was forced to call an emergency meeting to vote on their own removal. The community, empowered by the revelations, overwhelmingly ousted Simmons and his cronies. In the weeks that followed, the developers withdrew their proposal amid mounting public pressure and legal scrutiny. The HOA underwent a radical transformation, with new leadership committed to transparency and respect for property rights. As calm returned, John stood on his ranch, the sun breaking through scattered clouds. The ground was still damp from recent rains, the same rains that had marked the beginning of his fight. He looked out over the fields, breathing in the fresh scent of earth and hope. The wedding never happened on his land, but something far more important had been celebrated, the community's right to protect what was theirs. John smiled, knowing that sometimes the fiercest storms bring the clearest skies, and the ranch, his home, had finally found peace.